Yo, everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer and artist of the upcoming Living Hell over at Dark Horse Comics. It's Caitlin Yarsky. Thanks for coming on, Caitlin.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we're recording this on Wednesday, September 4th. It is undoubtedly a busy week for you. How's the day treating you so far?
Pretty good. I don't have a table or anything at Rose City coming up, so it's not terrible right now in terms of like juggling things. I'm just working on the comic. I'm on issue 2 right now, so trying to stay ahead of things.
So you knew what I was talking about from the jump.
Yeah.
Yeah. It is interesting, though, because even though you're not tabling, I'm sure that Rose City will be kind of exhausting. Are you going to be going multiple days? I know you have a lot of stuff going on Saturday, but will you still try to go and see people and rub elbows and do all the things you do at a con?
I'm probably going to try to just kind of get everything out of the way on Saturday. I'll try to see people maybe afterwards. But yeah, as far as the con goes, I'm going to go like Saturday. I'll do a panel, do a signing, and then just kind of like do the rounds and say hi to everybody for sure.
Are you not an extreme con fan?
I do like cons. For this, it was too much. I was already working on the book and I just didn't have time to like put that all together.
Yeah, that's totally understandable. I have to say, though, that Saturday panel is kind of crazy. I was like looking at the lineup for that. And,
oh my God, it's insane.
It's like creator-owned comics with Dark Horse. And you're like, okay, what is this going to be? And you're like, Patton Oswalt, Jordan Bloom, Brian Michael Bendis, Michael Conrad, Kelly Sue DeConnick, Zach Kaplan, and you. That's both quite the lineup. And also, they probably have to have a pretty big stage for all that.
Yeah, to say I'm intimidated is an understatement, but it should be fun either way.
I think it'll be a lot of fun. But so today you were working on Living Hell number 2, is what you said?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
How's it going?
Pretty good. It was a weird, it takes a little while to go from one issue to the next. I don't really know why that is. It feels like a big kind of like an energy push to like start the next issue. So it took me like a week and a half to really get going on like the next one. I just finished the last one and because then there's also like the marketing stuff you're working on and like, tweaking things and colors and lettering, and Clayton did the letter. So that was, a no-brainer. And he was amazing. So
you took one roll off. That was it. Just no lettering for you.
Yeah. I mean, he's one of my best friends and, we like working together. So I'm a little weird about this one. I wanted to try to do everything and like get as much of me in there as possible. And, possibly took on too much, but I'm learning as I'm going.
It seems like kind of for every project you take on, you're probably learning a little bit each time. There's like, whether if you're just drawing it, there's probably like specifics. Like one of the projects I want to talk about was Black Hammer Reborn that you did with Jeff Lemire. That is probably an interesting project because with your previous stuff that you'd done with like Sean Lewis, you'd done Coyotes and God, I'm trying to remember, Bliss? Was Bliss one that you did with him? Mm-hmm. You'd done multiple projects with him. Those are all original ideas. Those are things that you were doing yourself. But then Black Hammer, which is a creator-owned project, but it also has a ton of history as you're going into it. I imagine like that was a dramatically different type of project where you're like, okay, now I have to learn from what other people did and implement myself and my work into this entire world.
Yeah, totally. It was like a mix between working for DC and working for Image. It was like having this established universe, you know what I mean? But then also you're expected to have your own style and to kind of push it where you want it to go visually. And that was wild. It was like definitely a challenge, but I mean, the characters are so great. It was so much fun to like, draw my own versions of them.
What made that something you wanted to take on?
Okay, so I don't read comics as much as I look at the art. Sometimes I get it's almost, research more than anything else. And it takes a lot for me to want to sit down and fully read a comic. Like if I'm looking at comics, it's usually to study what other artists are doing, or I just love the art so much that I get distracted and I can't read it. Like I think I've tried to read Rumble a bunch of times and I own it and I barely know what it's about because the art is so beautiful that I just look at it like an idiot. So I read the original series, Black Hammer, and I was just so in love with the characters. And I was like, this is amazing. And wanted to kind of, throw my hat in the ring and see if they would want me to help continue it.
So you properly read it. You didn't actually just look at the pictures.
I properly read it,
okay.
Yeah.
It wasn't just you ogling James Herron art.
No. I mean, and Dean Ormiston is like amazing as well. But
yeah.
But the combination was perfect. And I was able to kind of like, get lost in that world.
I mean, that is one of the interesting things about Black Hammer in general is the fact that you have Dean Ormston and he's like kind of like the core of the book and as far as the main story is concerned. But then there's so many different people who have worked in it artistically that it provides this really varied world or varied view of what this one universe looks like. I don't know. I mean, it's pretty interesting. Was it Malachi Ward that did the other issues of Reborn?
Yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, even you two have a pretty dramatically different look. So it's pretty fascinating to just see that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's one of the cool things about that universe is it's so varied and every story feels really different because of the art. Yeah, it's just really exciting to work on.
So I talked to you for a piece that just published on Sketched. It was about art signatures. And one of the things you told me after we stopped recording that I actually included in the article was you talked about the fact that you came in being more interested in fine art and animation than you were in comics. Like you had a lot more interest in that. And I thought that that was really interesting because, I mean, that kind of ties into the fact that for you, when you look at comics, it's like you can get lost in the art because you're more focused on the art side of things, which might seem obvious for you as somebody who's primarily an artist, but it seems like it goes beyond that. How do you think coming into comics with influences that weren't just comics? Because sometimes I mean, you listen to my podcast with Kelly Sudaconic, like we talked about that, where sometimes creators can just be focused on feeding comics into comics. How do you feel like having those different backgrounds has kind of affected you as a storyteller and the types of stories you might want to tell?
I feel like there are advantages and disadvantages. Like I think that the part that's a challenge for me is kind of trying to catch up with the history of comics and people to look at from the past and just trying to get a feel of, what's been done and what I could take from that and what I could learn from that because there's so much to learn. And then also on the upside of it, I feel excited that I'm like, oh, I really love this artist and, this person has really influenced me, but I don't really see that influence in a lot of comics. So it feels fresh to be able to kind of like bring in some other outside inspiration and it kind of which I think there's definitely ups and downs to it.
I think the one thing that stands out to me about your work is the fact that, and this is probably related to the fact that you don't have the same influences as everyone else, but your art doesn't feel like other people. When I look at it, I'm like, just like, oh, that's Caitlin. That's not somebody else. I mean, it's just like with James Herron, there's not to cast aspersions about anybody who like was very influenced by him, but sometimes you look and you're just like, that person loves James Herron. But I look at your work and I'm just like, I don't know who Caitlin loves besides Hayao Miyazaki. I know you probably do because you do a lot of commissions of Miyazaki stuff.
Sure. I take that as a big compliment. I definitely, I don't see that in my own work. Like I don't see that having that like distinct style and I wish I could see that, but yeah, that's cool to hear. I love a lot of illustrators, like early 20th century illustrators, Arthur Rackham. I love like, some later people like Brian Froud and Alan Lee. I love, a lot of the old Disney where you could see all the pencil lines still and everything. And even old painters, when I'm doing covers, I like to look at the way, painters from the 19th century did things and then people from the early 20th century. And I just, it's all over the place. There's just so many influences that it kind of like melts into like one big blob of influence.
Oh, yeah. I always think it's really funny. People are always just, there's some obvious influences out there where, it's like, oh, this person loves Jim Lee. It's like obvious. You can see that this person loves X, Y, or Z. But a lot of times when I talk to artists, it's like J.C. Leyendecker shows up a lot, or like, Norman Rockwell shows up a lot, where there's these varying types of artists that you wouldn't normally think as big influences on comic artists that actually are really big ones. I think you're the first person that dropped a 19th century painters on me. So good job by you. Well, so when you look at your work, though, who do you see there? Because I'm not saying I want to go and find out or something like that, but it seems like you see your art differently than I might.
Yeah, I try to look at like I really like animated movies and I really love like stuff like The Iron Giant or the old like Fox Robin Hood or like these French movies called there's The Triplets of Belleville and The Illusionist, Sylvain Chomet, and I love that kind of warm, hand-drawn kind of looking, but kind of also vintage in a way. Like even if it's taking place in modern era, if it kind of feels old. Amelie is a really good example. It's like that kind of vibe is something I'm definitely going for with this story. But it's like it's kind of just a look that I always like to kind of gravitate towards.
It's funny, when you said that, I could actually see a little bit in Jerome's face. The main character from your book, Living Hell, Jerome Jamil, he definitely has like this kind of animated feel to it. It's like his face is kind of elongated in a way that makes him seem, I don't know, a little bit more, I don't want to say cartoonish because that's kind of like a 4-letter word, but he's kind of got a little larger than life feel to him, which probably for good reason. But I do want to go back before we get into Living Hell. I mentioned Black Hammer. Black Hammer is an interesting book because it's a big series. It has Jeff Lemire on it, who's a bigger creator. It was definitely the biggest project you've done to date. Do you think that taking that on changed things for you at all? Maybe in terms of how you're seen as an artist, or like maybe making it easier for you to pitch something like Living Hell successfully?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I learned a lot. I learned about how to integrate another world to my own style, and how to change my own style maybe to fit another world a little bit. I honestly wish I pushed my own style a little bit more in making Black Hammer, but again, it was all a learning experience. So, I think that that's something I'm very slowly learning is that it's okay to kind of just be who you are stylistically. So, yeah, and I think definitely it's probably helped with pitching things, having that on my roster, like, or, having that. So I think it was a lot of things, but yeah, it definitely helped. And I definitely learned a lot from it. Yeah.
Did you find that you tried to fit in with like the other artists rather than try to distinguish yourself when you're working on Reborn?
I think I thought too much about it.
Sure.
I think I overthought it. And I do the same thing with DC stuff when I'm working on backups or issues for them. I overthink how to fit their world rather than just let myself kind of go nuts. And so I'm kind of trying to, with this book, get back into like, what do I want my voice to look like visually? And I'm not even sure if I'm there yet. I think I'm just kind of like dipping my toes in and kind of pushing it a little bit more.
I do think that that is something that comes up quite a bit. For example, I was talking to Ryan Stegman a little while ago for the podcast where we talked about him taking on the X-Men, and he was saying something along the lines of like, he didn't really feel comfortable there for like 3 issues because he was so in his head about like, what exactly does his version of the X-Men look like? That can happen with any project, but I imagine for ones where it has like a history to it, or it has like a larger universe or whatever, you have to kind of balance what is right for this project and what is the right fit for my art on this project. And sometimes it's like, I imagine there can be a tension there. It's just like, what is the right answer between those two things? And sometimes that can be a challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea I had in my head was that you have to be a huge name to be able to do your own style when you're doing a big 2 book or you're doing something like really big. Like I had in my head that like, you don't have the right to do that unless you're like a giant. But I don't think that's true necessarily. I think that next time I do something like that, I'll probably just see how far I can push it. And if they tell me not to push it, then I'll know, but I didn't even ask. I just kind of played it a little bit safer than I wanted to.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to what we were saying earlier. You learn a little bit with every project you take on. But, well, let's talk about your upcoming Dark Horse series, Living Hell, which you're doing with / one of your best friends, Clayton Coles. This is strangely the second straight podcast I've done with somebody who is launching a Dark Horse title lettered by Clayton that comes out on November 6th, which I think is hilarious. Anyways, here is the solicit. Meet Jerome Jamil, husband, father, demon? Hell is not just a place, it's a prison, a realm where demons have lived in exile for eons. A few of them find a way back to the human world where they hide in plain sight. Jerome was one of the lucky few to escape and start a new life, and for the sake of his daughter, Jerome is determined to stay out of trouble. But when he comes face to face with one of Hell's bounty hunters, his plans go awry. I read the first issue. I really dug it. It was a really great idea, and I really like where you're taking it. Let's start with its roots because, we were just talking about how you wanted to find something you were comfortable with. Where did this idea start for you? Was this about you trying to find something that really fit you in total, basically?
Yes and no. I had a bunch of ideas that I was kind of shopping around to different publishers, and this is one that hit. And I think I wanted to definitely bring in mythology from a bunch of different places, kind of Sandman-esque, where you can kind of somehow meld different mythologies and they live in the same world for some reason, but you don't question it too much. Like this version of Hell is supposed to kind of be like the underworld / afterlife for a lot of different cultures. So he's going to encounter a lot of these different demons that are from all over the world. But yeah, I don't think it's going to encapsulate me as a whole. I think I put too much pressure on me doing something like that. And I'm only like just now kind of being like, you know what? This is my first time writing and drawing something. Maybe it doesn't have to be like my magnum opus or like, represent me.
That's fair. So you knew that you wanted to incorporate mythology in it. You had some ideas.
Mm-hmm.
What made Living Hell the next project you wanted to take on and the one that you are doing now, I guess?
Again, because there's different kind of places around the world I can take from and, have fun with, I think that I kind of wanted to marry that, like my love of mythology and folklore and things like that with things I know, they do there's the whole like, write what you know thing. And I think when I first heard that, I was like, well, it was like really literal. I was like, well, how does that work with like fantasy or science fiction? But it absolutely does. It's just like, so there's so many things I've peppered in here from my own life. And that, if anybody knows me or knew me growing up or knew me while I was living in upstate New York, they'll be like, hey, that looks like that place from Rochester, or that, that sounds like you and your dad, or that's, you know what I mean? It's like all these different things that kind of, I'm like, oh yeah, this character is kind of like an amalgam of these two people I know. And so it's kind of like a mix between like, a little bit of me and my own experiences and, the things that I loved growing up, which is like fairies and monsters and things like that.
So you've always found that pretty appealing, like the world of, you said fairies and monsters, but I mean, this definitely involves some demons and there's the word bounty hunters in there. Like there's the people who deal with the demons and try to bring them back. It seems like that is something that you've always found really appealing. Like, what is it about that you find so appealing?
I realized that there's like different movies and things like that I gravitate towards. I love, Blade Runner and, the Philip K. Dick story that was based on. And yeah, the bounty hunter part was more plot devicey. I just really love the folklore and mythology aspect to things. And I kind of wanted to figure out how to bring that in. So yeah, it's definitely darker than I expected I would go for my first story, but it's also, they're not really demons. Like they're demons technically, but the whole idea is like literally demonizing and othering people. And the fact that there's some demons coming up in the next issue that are like, they're these jikininki, which is like these Japanese corpse eaters.
Mm-hmm.
And they own like a funeral home and they're just like trying to get by and like they eat the corpses that they get. They're like doing a public service. It's not like, so like most of these guys are just like, so he's basically an anti-hero, main character. And you're realizing that these they're called demons, but they're not really. They're just doing their thing,
That's what I really like about the first issue is it has this big idea to it, but there's also a very domestic side to it where Jerome Jamil, this demon living on Earth, or this at least demonized individual who is living on Earth after escaping hell, he is married and he has a kid and he's a very well-loved dad, much to the chagrin of his wife to some degree. And he's also occasionally very bad at keeping a job because his demon ways kick in from time to time. So, I mean, who can't relate to a person who, can't keep a job, has struggles with their day-to-day life, all these different things. But this person also happens to have powers and is a demon of some variety. And I think that part is what really, at least so far, it really set it apart for me and it made it really interesting. Like on my screen right now, I have a scene open that is Jerome working at the bar with Uncle Felix, who is his friend. And it's just like, like looking at this, it almost kind of has more of like a sitcom vibe to it, just looking at it. What made that, like the domestic side of it, an appealing angle to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think the domestic side is the most important part. Like the rest of it doesn't really matter if you don't care about the characters, right? So
right.
Like that's one of those kind of through lines in movies, TV, games, books, everything. It's almost like window dressing, all these, like all that kind of the magic part or the sci-fi part or whatever it is. It's all about the relationships and I wanted to have fun with those. So I took a lot from real life and I was just kind of trying to see, how to show that. Like, for example, like Jerome and his daughter, I wanted to stay away from tropes of like, one parent is dead or both parents are dead or one parent is dead and he was like the best parent ever and then died tragically and you have to go like get revenge and stuff. And I was like, well, why don't I just do like my, stuff from my own life? Like my parents divorced when I was like 1. So I grew up more with my dad than my mom. But whenever my stepmom and dad and my siblings are together, like there's tons of laughing and making fun of each other and inside jokes. So, I kind of wanted to show that because I haven't seen a lot of that in comics or shows or whatever. And it's actually been really kind of hard to translate it because, every family has such a unique way of communicating and jabbing each other and stuff that trying to find a way to do that in a comic form that would like read to everybody has been really tricky.
Yeah,
you know?
I imagine. So you're the writer and you're the artist. That's a first time.
Mm-hmm.
That is one of the things that I think is really interesting about it is because now you're the one, it's like you're not, if you're waiting for a script, you're waiting for yourself. You're like defining all elements of that. Obviously, this project wouldn't exist without you, but how difficult was that for you to get used to? Like the idea that you were doing, that you're going to be doing both.
Yeah, definitely difficult, because there's so much doubt coming in now. Like you get to a point with your art career and you feel like, okay, maybe I've got the swing of this a little bit and you don't worry too much. And now you bring the writing into it. And I'm like, oh shit. Oh God.
Yeah, I imagine it could cause like some paralysis to some degree because you're no longer executing somebody else's vision. It's like your ideas completely on the page. And that kind of makes it sound like maybe like we're judging you. It's like, oh, we have to judge the totality of her or something like that.
That's what it feels like, though. It's like, I don't know if you've ever played in a band, but it's like the difference between playing in a band and doing an open mic by yourself.
Sure.
Like, there's nobody to hide behind. There's no orchestra. There's no band. There's nothing that like, there's no writer that like is kind of fielding things for you or like shielding you from like you're it. So like when things go out, like I don't even know if I'm going to look at anything online like when it comes out because I'm like so scared. But yeah, that's definitely a thing, and it was super paralyzing for a while. Luckily, Dark Horse has a really long schedule when it comes to creator-owned books, so I was able to get out of that funk.
Why did you want to take on writing?
Oh, I actually have written something before this, but it was a short story. It was for Boom, and it was a Buffy story. I love Buffy. It's like my favorite show ever. And I realized as I was like sending them ideas, and first of all, they hired me and I thought I was just doing the art. And then they were like, so do you have any, like, what are your ideas? And I was like, excuse me?
Like, I'm waiting for the writer to tell me, come on now.
Right? And they're like, yeah, you're doing both. And I was like, oh, okay. But I sent over like 4 to 5 ideas like immediately because I know that world so well that I was like, I was just cranking them out and I was really excited and I had a lot of fun. I had so much fun writing it and drawing it, and it kind of lit the fire for me. So I think that's when I first thought, hey, I think maybe I could try doing this. But that was like, I think that was in 2020. So it's taken this long for me to kind of like get it together and actually do it.
Did you find that when you were writing that Buffy story, that it actually got you more excited to draw as well?
Yeah, because I think it was the first time I felt totally free to do whatever style I wanted or to like kind of push it however I wanted. There was no constraints at all.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I did feel that way with Sean Lewis's books because it was creator owned and we were kind of partners and we talked about the story together. So there was that, but this was completely, my own. So it was the first time I felt like I could kind of be like, this is my style and, of writing and drawing. And I think that kind of helped with this too, with finding a style for it.
So you said it took you a while to get to this position, like you've been kind of building up to it. What was that path? Was it always living hell? Was it different ideas? Was it you figuring out exactly what the shape of something like this had to be? Like, what was that process to getting to where you needed to be to execute this?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't constant since 2020. It was sort of just like in the back of my mind kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I only really started looking into doing it like a year and a half ago, something like that. And I kind of just wrote a ton of different ideas down and kind of threw them over to some friends and was like, what do you think of this? And, I've gotten a lot of feedback from friends and family, which is really nice. Like, people were kind enough to be like, I don't know about this, or I like this idea. So it kind of helped me hone down like what I wanted to do and the kind of stories I wanted to tell. So there's a good handful out there that I've already got kind of like an established, that I think I still want to pitch. And also ideas that I came up with while I was writing this that I was like, oh, this isn't for this story, but I should put that away for another time.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. In the borderlands between imagination and reality, between horror and fantasy, between life and death, you'll find The Autumn Kingdom #1 on sale this September from Oni Press. From master storyteller Colin Bunn and visionary artist Christopher Mitten, follow one family's labyrinthine descent through a perilous forest where the local folklore is anything but a myth. This fall, a dark and enchanting new breed of fairy tale takes hold in the Autumn Kingdom #1, on sale now in comic shops everywhere. And now, back to the show. I mean, that's one of the nice things, and I guess part of the reason why I talk to a lot of artists who end up writing for other artists simply because they end up coming up with too many ideas, and they're like, I can't draw all these ideas. I got to work with another artist so I can get that done. It's a great way to get everybody more work, I think. But it is interesting, though, because there's different levels of ideas. I'm sure that there are some where you wrote down a little bit and you're just like, I don't know about that. But then other ones where you're like really feeling it and you started developing it more. What was that like when you were first in the kind of the idea generation stage? Were you just doing like elevator pitches like Jaws meets Scott Pilgrim? Actually, that sounds kind of fun. What would that be like? Or is it more like, here's a paragraph breakdown of what this idea is? Like, where were you at in like the initial idea stage?
Yeah, I was just throwing everything against the wall. I had a bunch of different Google Docs and I would just kind of write down ideas as they came, either I would sit down and try to come up with ideas or something would just like occur to me randomly while I was grocery shopping and I would email myself the idea, and then if something really felt like it was hitting, I would kind of be like, okay, I think I want to flesh this out more. And I would start writing out like an outline for it or, like how I would want to do it as an arc, that kind of thing. So there's a bunch of half-baked stuff out there in my Google Docs world that, it has like, it's like 3 paragraphs of an idea. But I don't really know what the structure should be. I'm kind of just doing it intuitively. I probably should ask Becky because I work with her. Because basically like what she's doing is kind of what I'm hoping to do eventually. Like,
are you talking about Becky Cloonan?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. We have a studio. I work in your studio. So I would love to be able to do just like writing and drawing of like my own stuff, but then not constantly, like maybe write for, like you said, like other artists in between that so that you don't kind of burn yourself out doing art all the time. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of like my ultimate goal. It's like some writing gigs and then intermittently doing my own like comedy, solo project.
Isn't it funny how ideas come to you when you're doing things like grocery shopping? It's like the most inconvenient time. You're like, you're getting some onions and all of a sudden you're like, oh God, I got to write this down.
Yep. It's nuts. Yeah. And then you email yourself and you're like, don't lose this email, which I always like, everything gets buried, The other tricky part is like, you have to write it in a way that you can interpret it later too. Because like, I've talked about this in the podcast before, but sometimes I'll literally write an email to myself, like right as I'm going to bed. And then the next morning I'm like, I don't know what that means. What am I supposed to do with this? Yes, I have done the same thing. And I'm like, what was I thinking? What are these words put together? What was I supposed to, like, what is that? And it just feels like gibberish.
Yeah. Why would past me think that I could interpret this later and convert it into something actually interesting? This is a terrible idea. Bad job, me. Past me.
You're probably half asleep, That doesn't help.
It is funny though, because everyone's kind of got their go-to. I'm not saying that grocery shopping is your one, but mine is mowing the lawn. And I think, if I remember correctly, I think Jeff Lemire said on the podcast that like showers are a place where he'd come up with ideas quite a bit. For all the Jeff Lemire super fans or Jeff Lemire himself, I apologize if I'm incorrectly mythologizing him, but I believe he said that on the podcast. And ideas can come at any time. It's just sometimes it'd be nice if it happened if you were near a piece of paper or a computer, because it'd be a lot more convenient that way.
Yeah, I think there was somebody who's doing like some kind of TED talk about inspiration, and they were talking about Tom Waits and how he had a story about driving down the highway one time, and he got an amazing idea for a song, and he like was so frustrated because he was driving. He looks out his windshield and he's like, "Can't you see I'm driving?" Like, where is he going to write down his music idea while he's like on the road?
Yeah, exactly. I think Tom King told me once that he will not, something like he wouldn't write ideas down. And if he remembers it, he knows it was a good idea. And I'm just like, Ooh. Oh my God, I'm so stressed for all of your ideas right now.
Right?
Yeah, it's just like, what if you the best idea? And then you're like, I forgot it. I guess maybe the argument would be it wasn't a good idea, but still.
I don't know though, but is that true, or is it just undeveloped? And you could have been like think of all the books. Oh man.
Tom King seems pretty busy, so I think it's working.
He's figured it out. He's whatever he's doing is working.
When you were doing that Buffy book, before they were like, oh, by the way, you're writing this, did you always want to write your own stories as well?
I hadn't really thought about it a ton. I think that was the end goal, but it was like kind of down the line and I was more focused on art. But honestly, growing up, I've always like I drew a comic instead of writing an essay to get into college. Like I did comics, I just didn't think about it. Like I kind of did them in school and just on my own. I didn't really think that I was going to be a writer slash artist. I thought I was mostly going to do art and that maybe eventually down the line I would write because art was definitely where my passion is and where, or my first passion is like, it's where I kind of focused all my energies growing up. So, but yeah, it was always on the back of my mind.
When you actually get down to writing, when you're writing Living Hell, do you find that you still think visually first?
Yes, but I don't like break it down into panels until like way, way later. So I kind of write it almost the way like Sean Lewis did it when he was sending me scripts. They were almost like movie scripts. They were just like there was no panel breakdown, no page breakdown. It was just like a straight up script. So I was doing that for a while, and then I would like slowly, do the page breaks down, and then do the panel. I think I only broke it down into panels once I sent it to Clayton because I realized he probably needed that to do his job.
Yeah.
Yeah. He actually was like, we might have to talk about the format for the next issue. I was like, okay.
I mean, it's funny. I was going to bring up Clayton later, but it is in a weird way. I'm like, not that you strategically planned on becoming friends with Clayton, one of the best and most prolific letters there are in comics, but it is very advantageous to have somebody like him on your side because he's worked with basically everyone. And so I'm guessing he would be I mean, obviously you have editorial support at Dark Horse too, but Clayton is a really great first person to view this stuff, I'm sure, because he can be like, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?
Yeah. Oh my God. He's been a great, he's a great friend, but he's been a great resource too. Like I talk to him all the time about the industry and the way things are and the way they used to be and like kind of, pick his brain about things all the time. I mean, he's, a legendary letterer and he knows a lot about the history of comics and he's a collector and everything. So sometimes I can just be like, hey, what does this thing mean? I don't even know what this word is supposed to be. Like, I don't have all the terminology down necessarily. So sometimes I'll just be like, what is this? And like, or, something about the industry, be like, is this the way it's always been? And he'll be like, yes or no, or it's complicated. And yeah, he's always been really generous about, sharing what he knows about comics, which has been really nice. I think we met when I was in the middle of the first Image book I was doing with Sean, and we lived in the same town at the time. And yeah, and we hit it off and we started hanging out and we would do like art hangout, work hangs kind of thing, with like one or two other people who also did comics. Mostly, I think those friends were mostly doing web comics. And so yeah, we would just kind of get together and kind of have an impromptu work hang and work on our stuff and talk.
How hard of a sell was he on the project? Did you really have to woo him?
For Living Hell?
Yeah, I'm just kidding. I know. I'm sure it was a super easy sell.
He was like, you better have me as a letterer for your next project. And I was like, I promise.
I'm sure that was the case. I mean, that is one of the uncanny things about Clayton is, I mean, he's prolific and yet there's somehow he just keeps getting better. You would think that like the number of projects he takes on would result in some decrease in quality, and yet it's an increase in quality. That's not how I work, but that's apparently how Clayton works.
It's amazing. I mean, he does, and he works in so many different styles of books and, all over the map, everything from indie stuff like what I'm doing to, Marvel and DC. And, he's got the voices down for all these different like legendary characters. And like, as soon as he sent me a few samples of his lettering for this book, it was like, all of them could have worked. Like, I didn't even know which ones to pick because I was like, you just got it down. Yeah, he's amazing.
I like that there is, I mean, Clayton is very good at figuring things out, but it does have its own very unique feel when it comes from a lettering standpoint. And there's also like different, I like the kind of the way he treated the text on the screen in the video that Joe made, the daughter of Jerome and Sita. The different things he did for like treating the text on there is just fantastic. But just a couple things I want to bring up for the book itself. What made Jerome Jamil, the main character, what made him the right way into the story for you?
Yeah, I mean, again, I wanted to show somebody who had a good relationship with his family, had a really fun sense of humor and kind of dad jokes and all that kind of stuff, but also was sort of an anti-hero and doing kind of a horrible thing during like, the whole series. And it wasn't that he wanted to do them, but they were kind of like, this is my favorite therapy term, ego dystonic. Like, it kind of goes against who he is as a person to do what he's doing, but they kind of have the screws to him because they're threatening his daughter. So it's kind of like, I wanted to show somebody that you could like, but also that you knew was kind of messed up and doing something bad. And I like characters that aren't one thing or another. And that's I feel like most writers like that, more complicated, kind of gray characters.
One might say that he's in a living hell because of his situation.
Yeah, he's not having a good time.
No. Well, that is one of the things I think is interesting about this book, because initially, when I was kind of conceptualizing things that I wanted to talk about, I was thinking about how the book ends and where it leaves Jerome. And I was like, how do I talk about this book without talking about his new situation at the end? And then I realized that the trailer you made, great job, by the way. You made a trailer for this book. It actually says what happened, like what his situation is at the end, and you kind of address that. How do you handle that, or like want to handle that? Like, do you want to talk about that hook, or is that like kind of something you want people to discover as they read it?
Right. No, I think I'm okay with it. I think honestly, I'm looking at the first issue as like the setup.
Mm-hmm. A trailer in some ways.
A trailer.
A trailer to the larger story.
So I think that knowing that he becomes a bounty hunter and that he hunts other demons is kind of like a good way to maybe get people intrigued, even if it's a little bit spoilery, because the next 3 are about that and just about how he handles that job. So yeah, I'm okay with it.
I do think the one thing I really love it is, so he becomes a shepherd, right? That's like one of the people who go and they find demons and send them back to hell. He's like basically a bounty hunter. And there's 2 things I find really interesting about that. One, it gives you the ability to really go down a lot of interesting paths in terms of the mythology side of things, because like you said, you're bringing in Japanese mythology next time. His pal Felix, a demon of name that will be revealed in the first issue, a very famous demon, we'll put it like that. Like, he's there, so very on the table. There's, I'm sure, other places you're going to take us. The background of the first cover shows a lot of different potential customers for that very role. It's interesting because this both gives you a lot of really interesting places you can go with this one, but also it makes it the type of idea. It's almost like a procedural story where it's like, I don't know. I this term is kind of funny, but it's like there was like that TV show Grimm. I don't know if you ever watched that show.
No.
It was set in Portland, and it was a guy who was a cop who basically could tell when people were, I think, Grimms or no, he was a Grimm, but basically they could tell if they were like a demon or like mythological character or something like that. And so each episode would be him solving a different crime involving one of these creatures and then trying to like figure it out. It's kind of like Hellboy. You could kind of endlessly have Jerome doing things like that if you don't close the story out. It's an idea that has a lot of potential for more ideas, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely got a little bit of the Monster of the Week feel to it. It's definitely something that when I pitched it originally, it was supposed to be like 6 issues or something. And I think it was kind of just like, all right, well, calm down. This is your first story. Like, we could do 4 issues. So it's like, okay. So I think I had more demons in my original story, and I kind of had to pare down which ones I wanted to pick. But that was kind of the idea, is like, you have an overarching story about the family dynamics and his choices about what he's doing and the dynamic between hell and earth and everything like that. But then there's also like the ongoingness of it, the case by case thing, right? Where you could kind of just have as much fun with it as you want, do as many as you want. And I do hope, I don't think this will happen, but I think that I kind of want to leave it to be, if people like it enough that, I could continue it, because there's a lot to this world that, again, like you said, it is procedural, and you could keep going with it if you wanted to.
Yeah, you should have went in with like 8 seasons of 10 issues each, and then you could have got down to 6, because then that would have been like the reasonable one. They're like, okay,
that's smart.
Calm down, 150 issues. No, you can have 6. You're like, gotcha.
Man, they don't teach us how to negotiate in art school.
Like we said, always learning. You always can learn. That would probably just get you kicked out of the place. So it's probably terrible advice. But, we talked about domestic life, and I think that part is really interesting. But Jerome's wife, Sita, is a bit overly eager to buy into conspiracy theories and things of that sort. And It is interesting because of Jerome's gifts, powers, curse, whatever you want to call it, and because of his situation. It does feel like I almost have to look at all of his relationships with like a little bit of a leery eye, if that makes sense. And even like with his best friend, or I presume best friend, Uncle Felix, who's like a very famous demon who will go unnamed here. It feels like there's a lot of depth to these characters that will be revealed. And like, I just want to say, good job by you. It's like, that's some
thanks.
A+ writing stuff for I'm going to say second timer, but somebody who's, very new to the writing comics thing.
Oh, well, thanks. That's really nice. I wanted the characters to all be kind of, to have a little bit more. Like, I didn't want anything one note. I think honestly, Sita might be the most one note character because she's kind of so hateable. And it's sad. Like, she's not a fun person. She's like, but at the same time, she's exhausted. She's working all the time. Like, her husband's kind of a flake.
Always going job to job.
Always going job to job. They're not making ends meet very well. And like, yeah. And I think for her, I was definitely taking from several family members who will go unnamed, but are kind of conspiracy nuts. And it is fascinating and super frustrating to watch them like just go about life thinking like all the things, because it's not usually just one. They start with one and then it kind of snowballs into like all of the conspiracy theory. And again, occasionally they're right. Occasionally there's one or two that like are a real thing, right? CIA stuff. They did horrible things back in the day, etc. But like,
that reinforces the rest of them.
It reinforces the rest of them. And it's like also one of those things where you can't convince them otherwise. There's no logicking them into anything else. Like, it's like a religion. Like, there's nothing you could say, because then they'll just be like, well, you can't read that news source. You have to read this news source. It's the, you have to read that website with the green background and the red text, all the weird ads all over it, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah. This is the pulling from real life stuff you were talking about earlier. It's just like you had to find what that really meant for you.
Yeah. And I still don't really know what to make of the conspiracy thing. I think it's almost, I don't want to say it's a mental illness. It's like, but it's kind of close to that almost. Like, sometimes if it feels that way from.
Are you talking about for Sita, or are you talking about for life?
Just in general, like when it gets to a certain point, you're kind of just like, oh, like this isn't impeding your, infringing on your life, and there's no talking out of it. Yeah.
I was talking to somebody the other day about this, and they were talking about how somebody they know, it's like they started watching like a YouTube video, and then next week they were talking about wild conspiracy theories. And it is kind of wild how like there's always these gateways. It's just like, oh, you watch this YouTube video, and the next thing you know, you watch another one, and next thing you know, you're talking about chemtrails, which I do want to note. Your comic did remind me that I don't actually know what chemtrails are. And I probably should prefer to not know what they are, based off of the fact that I only hear them involved with conspiracy theories.
Yeah. I don't remember what the exact definition is. I think that people think that it's just like, I think it's just like a normal emission from like planes, right? But like that people in the conspiracy world think it's like chemicals that are being released to like mind control people or to like poison us, or it's like, I don't know the exact thing, but it's something along those lines where it's like a normal thing, but people think it's like something really sinister.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. The hits just keep coming on Zoop. There's still plenty of time to support campaigns from Simpsons legend Bill Morrison, The Art of Descender from Dustin Nguyen and Jeff Lemire, Great Pacific, the completely trashed edition from Ice Cream Man's Martin Morazzo and Joe Harris, as well as dozens of campaigns coming soon that you can sign up for launch notifications on. Most notably, campaigns from the legendary Joe Quesada, the new publisher of Panic Entertainment, Monster Forge Productions, and the final release from the late Ed Piskor, Switchblade Shorties. Zoop would like to thank all the creators who have recently submitted projects and urge more creators to submit your project to Zoop. Click the Submit Your Project link at zoop.gg, as they are providing services to even more creators than ever before. And now, back to the show. It's interesting. It's tough to balance sometimes, I think, the real and the unreal in stories like this. And I think the fact that this story is so grounded in like the reality of it, and like the minutia of just like, this guy isn't just a demon. He's a guy who really sucks at keeping a job and it has a great relationship with his daughter. Like, those things make everything feel a lot more believable. So good job by you.
No, thanks so much.
We talked about this a little bit earlier, but what was your process for this series when it came to actually creating it? Sounds like you went full script, full kind of like Sean Lewis movie style script.
Yeah.
Was it just basically script, layouts, pencils, inks,
Right.
etc.? Or did you have
Yeah.
are you still kind of figuring out exactly what your process looks like when you're a writer and artist? Because like that's one of the things I think is interesting is sometimes when somebody writes for themselves, maybe you don't do a full script and you actually just do it in layouts or something like that.
Yeah, I'm definitely still trying to figure it out. I'm just going by what's currently working and maybe that'll change later, but like when I was first starting on this, it was all writing. There was a little bit of like character design stuff and I would just post pictures of like here's what I think these characters might look like and they don't necessarily even like the people that I'm posting up like for like Instagram didn't even necessarily know what it was for. It was just kind of like character designs. So that was like kind of just dipping my toes in and just being like, what does this world look like, you know? But I was really focused on getting the script ready because that was like, you know, that's where the editors are most involved, where they're kind of like reading things and kind of helping you figure out like, well, does this really work or does that make sense? And, you know, should this be in this order? So, and that was where I was the most worried. You know, I wanted to make sure that the story made sense and everything like that. So for me, it was like first and foremost, front loading everything with the writing. And then the art came way later. And I'm honestly rewriting things as I'm drawing stuff too. So like I'll have the script up and I'll be drawing and then I'll be changing the dialogue as I'm drawing. That probably wouldn't work if there was like a team of people, like if I had other people who had to like depend on me for things or like I don't think writers can do that generally when there's like 4 or 5 people in the assembly line.
It actually does happen. I mean, sometimes what'll happen is I think this is a lot more common where you remove a piece of dialogue strictly because the art explained it adequately.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. And I've been doing that too, where I'm just like, oh, she's like saying a bunch of stuff here, but you could kind of see it right there in that panel. So just like, just kind of rid of that. Yeah.
Yeah, she's saying that she's mad, but then you see on her face that she's pissed, and you're just
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
sometimes you don't need words to do it because that's what artist Caitlin's for.
Right. Yeah. For this game.
I mentioned the signature article where you talked about how your background was more with like fine art and with animation. And one of the other things you said to me was basically like you didn't know that you could sign covers, which is why you didn't sign covers. And I actually think it's interesting because like I think a lot of times people come in that are really, really into comics and they come in and they have all this baggage about things about how they have to be done and how things should be done and all this stuff like that.
Mhm.
And so it puts, I think, I'm not saying it's wrong to feel like that because like loving comics is not a crime and making comics because you love comics is not a crime. But
Sure.
I think one thing that's interesting about this book is it feels like you don't have that baggage. It feels like you're pretty free in your storytelling, which maybe you wildly disagree with, but
Mhm.
I think that's part of the reason why it doesn't feel like other people is because it doesn't feel like somebody who is obsessed with comics, just somebody who's obsessed with looking at comics.
Right. Well, looking at it's more like just like stories in general. I mean, that's maybe a pretentious way of putting it, but like I love sci-fi and fantasy books. I love sci-fi and fantasy movies and stuff outside of the genres too. But like that's where I get most of my like inspiration from. So it's less that like I'm taking, yeah, like you said, it's less I'm taking from other comics, but it's more just like storytelling from all sorts of different mediums
Right.
and kind of putting them in because this is what I know how to do. I mean, I can animate, but I can't like animate like a full length feature thing or whatever, you know. And I can't like, I don't know I don't know filmmaking stuff, so I'm not going to go that way. It's almost like this is where my skill set is, and so I'm kind of telling a story in the way that I can, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Obviously, you're fairly new to this, but do you think you would write differently for another artist than yourself?
Yeah, I was listening to Kelly Sue talking about that and like, how she was trying to write differently for David and then she, figured it out herself. But like yeah, I was wondering about that. I mean, I guess it really depends. Like, well, you first have to really feel connected to that artist already. So hopefully there's an alignment there, before you even get started. But I really don't know what that would be like. Yeah, I haven't thought too much about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's one of those another thing you'll probably learn when you actually do it. But there's another partner, Dark Horse. Why was Dark Horse the right home for this series?
Oh, I mean, I've been doing a lot of work for them the last few years, and they've just been really great to work with. And I did pitch to different, a few different publishers, and I've relationships with some of the editors, like from other projects. Dan Chabon was great to work with on Black Hammer, and I kind of feel like at home with them. I like working with Image too, and I think those are both companies that I would want to keep pitching to in the future. I just think that they're really open and, open-minded to people doing different things, like me just kind of being like, hey, I'm a writer now. Can I do this thing? And then kind of being like, all right, let's see what you got, So I really appreciate that they did that, and that they're also not like they weren't so involved. I mean, the editing was great because it was like a perfect balance of like, I think this is working, I think this isn't working, but they weren't like, let's write this together.
Yeah.
It was more just like, we like what you're doing already, and we just want to help, which is awesome.
They gave you space, but assistance if you needed it.
Totally.
Yeah, that is really nice. Also,
Megan Walker is my editor. She's great.
Oh, that's great. Well, the other benefit too is, not that you're necessarily going there all the time, but they are local. So,
True.
Milwaukee, right?
Yeah, it's right down the street, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It sounds really far away because you just start thinking about Wisconsin, but
right.
I mentioned the trailer you did for the series, and that's a really cool thing. And one nice thing about working with Dark Horse is that means you have promotional support. But, for a new book like this, promotion is super important. Because this is a solo effort, it's all on you. How are you feeling about that side of things? Is that new?
Yeah, super new. It's probably the most stressful part, honestly.
Yeah.
Because I feel like, the biggest thing I've done is Black Hammer, but that's the biggest thing. So there's no, like, I don't have like a giant name to like be able to already have, there's not already like so many people following my account that that the promotional stuff will be, I wouldn't say easy, but just like, I feel like it's particularly tricky because I'm trying to find new people, find an audience, find the people that are already following me and make sure that they know about my stuff. Like, I just don't really know how to go about it. And the marketing team, they're doing great at Dark Horse, but there is also a lot of stuff that I'm trying to do on my own. And it's, I don't really, I don't know what I'm doing. There's, when you go to art school, they don't teach you how to do this kind of stuff. So it's kind of just like, you're asking around a lot. You're asking different creators and different artists and writers, like, how did you do this when you were working on your thing? And so, I'm kind of crowdsourcing and getting information and suggestions for people, which is helpful. But yeah, I don't really know how to do it. I'm learning as I go.
That is 100% legit answer. And also, I don't think anybody knows how to do it. That's one of the difficult things, because there's all these different wrinkles to it. It's like, what does success look like? You don't even really know if you're making a difference until Final Order cutoff ends and you find out how many books or comics were actually ordered. And so I think that's one of the difficult things is, like, I imagine as you're doing it, you're trying your best, you're doing all these different things, but you don't really know what's moving the needle and what's not moving the needle. So you just hope for the best, basically.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard other interviews that you've had people on where you were talking about marketing, and it sounds like you just have to do a bunch of different books and you find out as you accumulate books. You know what I mean? It's like you're not going to learn on your first try or even your second. It's kind of like you kind of figure out patterns as you go, and then and everybody has like a different way of putting together their strategy for it. So yeah.
I was going to say, like, every once in a while, there's a book like Patrick Horvath. I don't know if you saw this book, but it was Beneath the Trees Where Nobody Sees. It was an IDW book from last year and earlier this year. And it was like a book that came from somebody that I respect, Patrick, most people had not heard of yet. And all of a sudden it became like this sensation, and shops were just like, this book is selling out constantly.
How did that happen?
No one knows. I mean, it's a great book, but there's a lot of great books out there. So it's like, there's always like something that is kind of impossible to point to, where it's just like, comics is a force of nature, and just sometimes something hits, and what can you do about that? But do you feel like the commercial aspect of the work changes the creative work? Like, do you think about projects differently because of that? Or do you just choose to ignore that side and just focus on the work entirely?
You mean in terms of like changing, like focusing on certain stories because you think that they would sell better, or things like that? Or?
Yes, things like that, or like, how you might tell a story. It's like getting to point X, Y, or A, B, or C sooner rather than later, because you're like, I need this sizzle from the start. Like, does that factor into your arithmetic at all? Or is it mostly just like, you just have to do what feels right to you?
Yeah, I'm trying to stick with that as much as possible, just because, I listen to a lot of these, your podcast is amazing, and it's a great way to like feel connected to other creators. And I listen to them all talk about their journeys, and a lot of them say like, you just got to do your own thing, and like and not worry too much about how it's going to be received, or the way, I think there's certain strategic things like, I want to leave this open-ended in case people like it and I could do another series with it, like that kind of thing might change the writing a little bit. But in terms of like writing a story that that's based on what you feel like people are going to want, I don't know about that. I think it's when people say that they're trying to stick with like what they're excited about, that's probably the way to go.
Yeah. I mean, I always say it's hard to make people excited if you're not excited about it. And also, how do you aim for what people will like? If it was that easy, everybody would just do it all the time.
Right. Right. And I think people can smell that too.
Yeah.
I think people can tell when you're doing something that you think is just going to be popular.
You mean like kind of if you're very clearly trying to like reverse engineer something?
Yeah, like if you're just trying to appeal to, people based on the age or or trends or whatever.
Yeah, I just like if your comic was filled with dabbing and all of a sudden like it was just so aged out. Just no one does that anymore, people. Come on. Dabbing is over. I've tried doing that. My wife makes so much fun of me. Like I remember when it was like really popular and she's like, stop it. Just don't. Don't.
Wait, what's dabbing?
It's the thing where you go like this.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. This is like for people that don't know, I was just dabbing. So
yeah, it's funny that like all of these like trends and things that I'm only now becoming aware of are already going out of style.
Yeah.
Like Gen Z is like, how I can tell you're a millennial because you do this thing. And you're just like, I just learned about that thing last year. Like, I'm so behind.
That was so 10 years ago. I'm like, I learned about it last week.
Right.
I mean, it's funny. As I believe you know, I live in Anchorage, Alaska, and I always say that we get all the trends like way later than everybody else. So it's like we're importing them by dog sled or something like that. And so like years later, it's just like,
David Bowie.
Have you guys heard of 8-tracks? It's unbelievable. The sound quality is unheard of. To close, I want to talk about some bigger things. And, we talked about learning. Learning is a big part of this. And you've been working in comics for a bit now. You have some notable projects under your belt. You've written 1.5 comics. I mean, you've written issues, but you're on your second one. How do you think your work has changed since you started making comics? Like, do you feel like you have a better understanding of who you are as a comic creator and what you want to do as a storyteller now?
Oh, yeah, for sure. I feel like it's been a lifetime since I started and it's only been, it's been like 7 years, maybe 8 years. But yeah, I feel like I've kind of come a long way in terms of figuring out how I can fit my own style or use my own voice in comics and it working for the comic industry. Like the biggest thing I could say is I remember you talking to Jen Bartel about this, I think, because she started off as like an illustrator as well. Like I got my BFA in illustration. So it was hard to go from illustration to comics because I wanted every panel to be like an illustration. And it's a different thing. It's really a different thing. It's an illustration is one contained image that's usually like a lot of detail, a lot of rendering, or however you do it, it's a more complete picture. And honestly, I'm learning that like sometimes less is more, and there's sometimes where it's nice to put details in, but to serve the story, you kind of have to let things go or take things out. So that's been my biggest thing in terms of like visually. And yeah, and I think my style is different in comics than it would be in other forms, like it's its own thing because of the medium.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think comics offers a lot of unique kind of points of conflict, if that makes sense, where it's just like your best work isn't able to be done because there's time as a huge factor. And there's also like, maybe the thing that you might think you're best at doesn't necessarily fit comics super well. And so you always have to like kind of find the right answer for the right project at the right time. And so I imagine that's one of the things you've learned as you've went along is just like when certain things are the right answers and how to best apply them, I guess.
Yeah, because the readability is more important than, the flourishes you want to put in something or how much rendering you want to put in. Like I would love to put as much detail in a panel as I do on covers that I paint, because those are much more painterly. But at the same time, even if I did do that, I don't think it would read as well. I think it would impede the story because I've seen examples of that where you see really super highly detailed and or realistic comics, and it actually kind of distracts you from the story because it's harder to move your eye from place to place.
Using this as a shoehorn because I feel like I've completely forgotten to include this, a very important thing. You draw a really great dog. Did you put all of your eggs in the dog basket? I feel like your hellhound is fantastic.
Thank you. I put a lot of thought into him. I fucking love dogs and I've grown up with them. Some of the jokes in there are directly from the dumb ass dog we had growing up who, yeah, she was so dumb and we loved her, but there's not a lot going on upstairs. I just think that they're great. And we have plenty of cat stuff on the internet. And I kind of wanted to bring in some love for dogs. And he's also kind of like a little bit of a comic relief, a little bit of showing what's going on in Jerome's heart on the outside. You know what I mean? So he's kind of there to be kind of Jerome's heart, I think.
You draw the hell out of that dog. You draw the hell out of both versions of that dog. That might count as a spoiler, but I will say there was a brief moment where I was very upset with you about the dog, but then
yes.
There's a follow-up that made me much happier. And like the introduction to the dog's personality, there's a single panel, new hellhound check. And the dog is making like the most ridiculous face that has ever existed. Yeah. And it is spectacular. It's probably like if there's an Eisner Award for best character acting with dogs, you would definitely have clinched it with that moment.
Thanks. Yeah, I knew people were going to be really mad at me for that one panel. And I was like, I have to fix this on the same page. Maybe within 2 panels, or people are going to like throw this out the window. I will
stop turning the page.
Seriously, I'm pretty sure people would. So I was like, this has to be resolved so fast.
I do think it's funny how like in pop culture, it's now like people are like so afraid of animals dying that like people are like spoiling their own stories because they're just like, oh God, like people won't watch this if they think that this animal is imperiled.
Yeah. And people will tell you that. And I mean, I understand. I love animals, but like, get a grip. Like it's going to be okay.
Things happen. Things happen. Yeah. No, I totally understand. Back to the original non-dog topic. Like, do you think you have improved in ways you can point to? Like, are there things you see and you're just like, I'm better at storytelling. I'm better at dogs barking. Like, are there things that you know that like, I can see that now?
Oh, absolutely. I feel like in a lot of different ways, I'll look back at things and be like, oh, I really improved here. I think honestly, working for DC helped me with male anatomy, just drawing men. I feel like I was never great at them. And then I kind of had to learn how to draw men better. I feel like most artists are better at drawing whatever gender they are or identify with, and that was really true for me up until I started doing superhero stuff. And when I started doing superhero stuff, I was like, all right. So now I have to figure out how these muscles attach and how they move when when the arm's twisted and just like things that are hard to get away with without knowing the anatomy. So I definitely feel like I got men down better. And I think like consistency with characters. And also I used to, for Bliss, I did all the characters in Bliss were based on real people in my town. And I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to draw characters consistently or in an interesting way without having like really like hard like reference photos for everything and models, right? But I'm getting better at that. I'm like learning how learning how to turn characters' faces around in 3D space in my head and kind of like realize, okay, this is how their nose would look in this situation. And I'm still basing it on people. Like usually it's like very loosely based on a celebrity or something because there are so many pictures of them at different angles that it makes it easier to like kind of get a handle on that. But that's definitely something too.
Who's Jerome?
Oh, it's Numan Akar. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but he's an actor. He's kind of a character actor. He has a great face. And I'm fairly certain he's different enough that I can say without getting in trouble. But he was the first inspiration.
I can definitely see it. I see it. I do want to say that you've made Jerome very stylish. Like his, I don't even know, scarf doesn't feel like the right word, but like
it's like one of those infinity scarves, like it goes around.
Yeah. The scarf superstructure that he's wearing around his neck along with his like overall outfit. It's weird that this is how I know that I'm following that. There's this like Twitter accounts like Dye Workwear. It's like the menswear guy that everyone lives simultaneously in awe and fear of. And I actually saw him and I was like, I feel like the menswear guy would definitely appreciate Jerome's outfits. Like it works for him. So good job for you for both the inspiration of Numan Akar and also the excellent outfits. But last question. We talked about a little bit about Rose City Comic Con earlier. You're going to be going this weekend. That's your current home con because you're in Portland, Oregon, a city with a serious connection to art and comics. You mentioned earlier you're in a studio with Becky Cloonan. I am curious as to like what impact does that community around you has. Like, do you think living in Portland and working closely with other artists has changed your work or career in a meaningful way?
Oh, yeah. Most of my friends out here are in comics. I moved out here. I think half the reason I moved out here, more than half the reason I moved out here, was because of the comic community. You know, there's a certain number of cities that have this, but not very many. I mean, there's like Toronto has a bunch. New York used to, but it got too expensive, and a lot of them moved out to like Pennsylvania, Jersey, places like that. And then there's like LA. As far as I know, those are like the major ones besides Portland. So I wanted to try out Portland because I thought, well, it's such an isolating job. And I think I mentioned that in the last time we talked. It's important to me to be around other people.
Yeah.
You know, not all the time when I'm working, but just to have the option. And so that's why, like, you know, I joined Helioscope for a good long time. And it's great. It feels like, you know, you've got other people to, you know, you talk to them about comics, you kind of get their opinion about things, you get to work together, you can commiserate. It's really nice. I mean, I think, I don't know if I'll stay here forever because I'm very close to my family and they're in DC. So I might end up going back at some point. But yeah, it's definitely changed my career and changed, you know, my social life. And it's been a good move.
Well, and I imagine like when you're in Helioscope or now that you're in a studio with Becky, and I imagine having those people, or like Clayton, having somebody that you can turn to, and it's just like, you know, you've been doing this for 7 years. You've been working in comics for a while, so it's not like you're completely new, but maybe there's something you don't totally know. It's like, what's the right way to approach this? Having those people that you can talk to, I imagine, is super powerful, especially as you're taking on your own projects and you're like, what's the right answer for a publisher? What's the right answer for how I'm going to do this? That's super important.
Yeah. I mean, and this is Eric Powell's studio, and we all work together and we'll talk to each other about, you know, issues, or we'll be like, what are you working on today? And can I see what you're inking? And, you know, or, you know, be like, I'm having trouble figuring out this marketing thing. And what did you do for your book? And it's really nice to be able to kind of bounce stuff off each other.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's really motivating. Oh my God, those two are like titans, right? So I'm just like sitting next to these two people doing like freakishly amazing work. And I'm just like, oh my God, like I'll just walk over there and be like, holy shit, that's amazing. And then it kind of gets you more excited and more motivated to do your own stuff, you know?
I do want to note, not to talk you up too much, but I mean, you were talking about how insane that panel is. You're going to be on Saturday, and you're talking about how you're in with the Titans. There is a good point to be made that you're right there with them. And I think that is a really cool thing. So good job by you, Caitlin.
Thanks. I didn't mean to like snort there, but
you're like, whatever, David, whatever.
Don't feel that way, but thanks. Yeah.
All right. Well, I hope you get to that point because you're great at what you do, Caitlin. But that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about living hell, chemtrails, and everything else. I really appreciate you taking the time.
This was such a blast. Thanks, David.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with writer-artist Caitlin Yarsky. You can find her on social media and her work in the upcoming Living Hell at Dark Horse Comics. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for stepping in to edit this episode. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my Eisner Award nominated subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me at @SliceFriedGold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Milton Lawson, David Wilson, Joe, Benjamin Wilkins, Chris Hacker, John Neesmith, John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Ninja Assassin Love Story Webcomic, David Byrne, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Kenny Myers, Faith Aaron Hicks, Ah Yeah Comics, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Danny Ollie, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polgees, Tom Evans, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sue DeConnick, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Holt, Near Levy, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Harry Johnson, Jingo Borent, James Steiner IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Submen Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Choi, Brandon Pills, Patrick Bauer, Declan Shelby, Dan Garino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kingus, Nick Bennett, Daniel Whitfield, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Stephen Holt, Philip Myra, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Buzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwan, Vita Yala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Heifel, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks from Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed off-panels, outro, and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.